Virginia Woolf transforms the excoriated self-consciousness that was such a bane in her personal life, so that to look in a mirror or to appear in new clothes was agony, into a formidable instrument of self-scrutiny. She spent considerable time listening to herself thinking, researching how the words for observations and emotions rose and formed in her mind, together with the nerve-quick motions of adjustment and revision made by the judgment in ordering this initial verbal material. This is a quote from Steve Davies' book, Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse, which gives us a glimpse into how Woolf developed her intimate, conscious exploring narrative style. Through this style, Woolf presents a plot less focused on the actions of its characters and more on how they react internally, with conversations and disputes used as kindling for such exploration. Woolf used her own inner thoughts and reactions to guide her choice of words and her subject matter, spending time scrutinizing her own thought loops and reactions to gather material. For example, in To the Lighthouse, Lily Briscoe often muses on the idea of creating her art, oscillating between pondering the position of certain features in a painting to criticizing her own self-worth and questioning why she bothers to pick up the brush in the first place. Questions that Woolf shared about her own work as a writer. To me, boredom is a desire for abstract excitement or stimulation that occurs between exciting and stimulating events. The experience we crave is not necessarily specific, for excitement for a particular thing can alleviate boredom in and of itself. Instead, we are simply hoping for something to break the monotony that we find ourselves in. The topic of boredom is one that has been tackled by philosophers also, whose definitions can aid in solidifying our understanding of boredom, how we become bored, and why we generally try to avoid it. Schopenhauer's definition of boredom is in keeping with his pessimistic philosophy. In his essay, The Emptiness of Existence, he states that life presents itself next as a task, the task, that is, of subsisting de gagner sa vie. If this is solved, then that which has been won becomes a burden, and involves the second task of its being got rid of in order to ward off boredom, which, like a bird of prey, is ready to fall upon any life that is secure from want. Here he is saying that life sways between two states, desire and boredom. When we have a desire, we pursue it, but when we achieve it, the prize we receive is a state of painlessness in which we can only give ourselves up to boredom. The only respite from said boredom is to repeat the cycle like Sisyphus with his boulder, although Schopenhauer does not imagine him happy in this case. Schopenhauer also theorizes that the very existence of boredom proves the valuelessness of existence, for if life, the longing for which constitutes our very being, had in itself any positive and real value, boredom could not exist. Mere existence in itself would supply us with everything, and therefore satisfy us. Along with boredom proving the meaninglessness of life for him, it is in such a state that we experience life at its rawest, for it is only when we are thrown back on existence itself that we are convinced of the emptiness and worthlessness of it, and this it is we call boredom. Despite being typically pessimistic, Schopenhauer's definition of boredom treats it as a baseline, a neutral state of being that we can't entirely escape, but only distract ourselves from through the pursuit of our desires. With this view that life is but one long attempt to ward off monotony, it is unsurprising that Schopenhauer thinks the whole cycle to be misery. Soren Kierkegaard has a similarly interesting take on the importance of boredom. Instead arguing that we have everything to thank for because of its existence, he takes the story of Genesis and argues that it was only out of ennui that God decided to make mankind and his world. We can trace this from the very beginning of the world. The gods were bored, so they created man. Adam was bored because he was alone, so Eve was created. From that time, boredom entered the world and grew in exact proportion to the growth of population. Adam was bored alone, then Adam and Eve were bored in union. Then Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel were bored en famille. Then the population increased and the peoples were bored en masse. This idea that boredom is an omnipotent force that can sway God himself backs up Kierkegaard's other claim that boredom is a root of all evil. Following this likely exaggerated statement, he discusses the paradox of boredom, how it is so still and static, but also has such power to set things in motion. The power of boredom to motivate parallels the state of desire humans tend towards that Schopenhauer discusses. It is a negative motivator, one that pushes us to avoid a situation rather than achieve a specific goal, lending some credibility to my previous claim that we long for abstract stimulation in a state of tedium, that we would take any means to remove us from it. Bertrand Russell is another philosopher who echoes the potency of boredom as a motivator, stating in The Conquest of Happiness that boredom as a factor in human behaviour has received, in my opinion, far less attention than it deserves. It has been, I believe, one of the great motive powers throughout the historical epoch, and is so at the present day more than ever. He then describes the relationship with boredom that the human race has had throughout the years, splitting our history in 3 phases. The hunter era, where we were always occupied and rarely bored. The agricultural era, where we spend a lot more time doing repetitive work or passing time with a very small community of people, resulting in an increase in boredom. The industrial era, where our work may still be tedious, but the density of towns and cities and the increase in activities available to us reduced our boredom once again. While Russell argues that we are less bored when he published the book in 1930, he states that we fear it more owing to our ability to counter it more easily. Whereas a man in the 1930s might be able to socialise, read or listen to the radio in their spare time, the agricultural man had to put up with the boredom. If we then bring in the point that he makes previously about the power of boredom to motivate, we can assume that a society that experiences less boredom is also less motivated because they are overstimulated. Perhaps this is by design. After all, Kierkegaard does say this in relation to boredom. Yet what was it that stayed the fall of Rome? It was pani and circenses. The theory of boredom's potency as a motivator, our natural inclination to avoid it, and its inverse relationship to the increase in technological advancement can be viewed within the context of 21st century life to explain certain phenomena. Russell's analysis ends in the 1930s, but his ideas about diminishing boredom levels and our fear of it appear to ring true nearly a century later. In fact, owing to the speed at which technology has advanced during my lifetime, this trend can be seen in the evolution of the smartphone. I was a very young teenager when smartphones hit the market, and even then they were a novelty, a plaything of the one rich kid in class who everyone gathered around to see play Angry Birds or Fruit Ninja. Flip phones were popular, but they didn't provide much in the way of distraction beyond 2 or 3 games. Before this, I did have access to television, computers, and little music storage devices to keep me entertained when I was in need of stimulation, but they weren't as diverse nor portable, meaning there were plenty of times where I just had to suck it up and deal with the monotony. Despite this being only a decade ago, this all feels light years away from what we have today. What with the ubiquity of handheld computers and all of the 7 social media apps they handle. Smartphones are a passport to modern living. Without one, a lot of processes are either slowed down or simply not available. We all carry little distraction devices around that can ease us from that painlessness and emptiness that Schopenhauer talks about at a moment's notice, leading to us losing our tolerance for it and fearing it more than ever. In my own experience, I really struggled to do anything mundane or spend time alone without some video or podcast playing in the background. I can never really recall what I have just taken in after turning it off or switching to something new because it doesn't serve as a piece of media that I deliberately consume, but noise that fills a void. I don't think I can say that I have been truly bored during the last 5 years. It feels unnatural and uncomfortable to be bored, but is it also unnatural to go so long without experiencing it properly? David Foster Wallace writes extensively on this topic of irony and television in E Unibus Plurum, but there is a lot of crossover with the topic of this essay. Simply replace the word television with smartphone, and the paper now makes sense in a modern context, demonstrating to us that this need to escape monotony has always been around. Wallace discusses the incentives of television, of how it isn't trying to make something that is necessarily novel and compelling, but something that simply keeps people glued to the screen for the sake of the advertisers. To achieve this, it must cast the widest possible net for its audience. TV is the epitome of low art in its desire to appeal to and enjoy the attention of unprecedented numbers of people. But TV is not low because it is vulgar or prurient or stupid. It is often all these things, but this is a logical function of its need to please audiences. And I'm not saying that television is vulgar and dumb because the people who compose audiences are vulgar and dumb. Television is the way it is simply because people tend to be really similar in their vulgar and prurient and stupid interests, and wildly different in their refined and moral and intelligent interests. This is the case with platforms such as TikTok and YouTube today, wherein the demands of the algorithm force video creators to create content that will appeal to the largest possible audience if they are to succeed on these platforms. This generates a feedback loop wherein viewers are given content that they view passively, updating the algorithm to demand more of it from the creators who comply and fulfill the cycle. This creates a false reality that is contained within our smartphones, trying everything it can to keep us watching, to serve as an antidote to boredom. Wallace puts this very succinctly for the case of television. Television used to point beyond itself. Those of us born in like the 60s were trained to look where it pointed, usually at versions of real life made prettier, sweeter, better by succumbing to a product or temptation. Today's audience is way better trained, and TV has discarded what's not needed. A dog, if you point at something, will look only at your finger. We aren't taking in what our phones point towards in the content they show us. We are simply looking at the phone itself and the false world it displays. This false reality is made the most enticing when it is colourful, exciting and new, but this presents a very interesting paradox that Wallace discusses for television. In lots of ways, television pervades and enables dreams, and most of these dreams involve some sort of transcendence of average daily life. The modes of presentation that work best for TV are unsubtle in their whispers that, somewhere, life is quicker, denser, more interesting, more, well, lively than contemporary life, as Joe Briefcase knows and moves through it. This might seem benign until we consider that what average Joe Briefcase does more than almost anything else in contemporary life is watch television, an activity which anyone with an average brain can see does not make for a very dense and lively life. Since television must seek to compel attention by offering a dreamy promise of escape from daily life, and since stats confirm that so grossly much of ordinary US life is watching TV, TV's whispered promises must somehow undercut television watching in theory. Joe, there's a world where life is lively, where nobody spends 6 hours a day unwinding before a piece of furniture, while reinforcing television watching in practice. Joe, your best and only access to this world is TV. Social media does the very same thing by inspiring FOMO for a more exciting existence while trying to maintain our extended viewership, which does nothing to make our lives more exciting. The world that is presented is made out to be real, and our best and only access to it is through our smartphones. This is made even more powerful by the ability to follow our peers. Before, it was the life of celebrities and rock stars that we glorified, meaning there was less shame in realizing that we would never reach their heights. But today, our neighbours, friends and family can post the best parts of their lives and make us feel a lot of shame. If they can do it, why can't I do it? This stream of noise that we now have access to make the feeling of being bored into a rarity, threatened only when one's phone is left at home or runs out of battery. Although Schopenhauer paints a very negative picture of boredom, it is a necessary evil, for without it, we don't have the space to think and contemplate what our desires actually are. The path of least resistance is to offset boredom through content instead of using it as the kindling for desire. From my own experience, the use of my phone during the quieter parts of my day often leads to some degree of brain fog, causing fatigue and a general lack of motivation to pursue my hobbies and goals. Sometimes I binge watch YouTube videos in my spare time and fall into a content coma, the cerebral equivalent of eating too much for dinner and having to sleep it off. Despite the toll it takes on my mind, I couldn't say I was getting much out of what I was listening to or watching except a shorter attention span and a widening but shallow bank of admittedly useless knowledge. It doesn't feel right, and I have been trying to forego my phone and just accept the duller moments life has to offer, although with mixed success. The reason that I began with that quote from Virginia Woolf may have seemed weird initially, but I hope it makes sense now. In a world that is increasingly intruding upon our personal space, we are given less time to think, less time to feel bored and motivate ourselves with said boredom. I recently finished Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and read about Woolf's internal research methodology soon after. The first thing I asked myself after reading these two books was this: would Woolf have been able to do this in today's world? As Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard and Russell say, boredom is a very powerful emotion that can inspire both the best and worst in human beings. With ever more distractions to hand, this potential power is easier to lose as we seek respite through the path of least resistance, that is content. If boredom be hunger and YouTube, TikTok and Instagram be popcorn, the pursuit of one's goals in the time we have is a healthy and substantial meal.